evening. Our top story this week. In California, Governor Jerry Brown signs legislation that gives CPS agents the ability to check to see if foster parents have criminal records. In Butler County, Ohio, CPS agents are on strike, and those who didn't go on strike were warned against doing so by their supervisors. In Nebraska, the child protective industry is going to have to pay the federal government $2.5 million due to their failure to pursue rebates on prescription medications, only a few months after being ordered to repay $22 million due to their failed child welfare privatization efforts a few years back. And in Connecticut, a 16-year-old girl is calling the child protective industry ineffective because they ignored the needs of her family over the years. In Pennsylvania, a former juvenile probation officer is suing Washington County after being fired for blowing the whistle about child protective industry and improperly placing children in juvenile detention facilities. In Maryland, the child protective industry is being criticized for not monitoring the placement of their foster kids who were placed in abusive homes. In Alberta, Canada, the child protective industry has failed to implement recommended changes designed to fix their child welfare system. And in New York, the Erie County child protective industry is taking so many kids that there is now a crisis-level shortage of foster parents. Nearly 300 women and children have been deported from family detention centers in New Mexico after the chickenpox quarantine put a stop to it. In Arizona, the school department is asking the federal government for $1 million to deal with the education of the border kids. And in Australia, the government has announced plans to release just under 20% of immigrant children who are being kept in detention centers. Also in Australia, the fears are growing that the government's plans to further deregulate inter-country adoptions will create a baby industry-style system. And in Nevada, a few of the kids who were separated from their brothers and sisters while in the foster care system get to reconnect for a whole week at summer camp. In Oregon this week, a 15-year-old girl runs away from her foster home. And in England, police are pursuing new leads in their hunt for 3 brothers who took off from their foster home. In Canada, a key deadline is nearing in a class action settlement regarding the abuse of former residents of the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children. In Pennsylvania, a couple of foster parents who lost their right to foster kids after their adopted son abused a 7-year-old is fighting to get that right back. In Colorado, a couple who was in the process of adopting a girl are now charged with her abuse after she was brought to the hospital with brain bleeding and bruises on her butt. Another Colorado woman pleads no contest to child abuse charges after her 5-year-old foster son nearly drowns in a hot tub. And in Minnesota, a foster care provider loses her license after being responsible for the abuse of a foster child last year. In California, a former foster parent gets 30 months in jail for sexually abusing an 8-year-old foster kid. In Ohio, a former foster mother gets 7 years for raping children. In Pennsylvania, a 7-year-old was placed in a foster home with an 18-year-old adopted kid who had a history of sexual abuse. A woman from West Virginia is looking at 20 years after having a sexual relationship with an underage foster child. And in England, social workers are being criticized for their failures regarding a 5-year-old who was sexually and physically abused. In Canada, the Newfoundland child protective industry is reporting 26 deaths of children who are under their care since 2009. In Florida, a CPS agent is arrested for falsifying records and claiming that a kid who died was safe, but she bonds out of jail. In Texas, more details are being released in response to the drowning deaths of 2 foster kids who couldn't swim. In Texas, a judge is deciding whether or not to allow a lawsuit against the child protective industry proceed after they failed to protect a young girl who died in an El Dorado drug house. And finally, tonight in Alabama, a CPS agent gets busted after he forced a young mother to have sex with him in return for not taking her kids away. For these stories and all the latest dirt on the child protective industry, visit www.legallykidnapped.com. And until next week, this is Baby LK, over and out.